Welcome back to Over the Top, Under the Radar. I'm Gary Young.
And I'm Carissa Foco.
2024 has been a year of elections in British news. With nearly 2 billion people around the world voting in 2024, there was plenty to talk about.
So here are some of our best moments on the campaigns, the results, and the impact of the changing leadership around the world. Some people will be listening to this episode in the dying days of 2024, and maybe some of you have saved it for the beginning of the new year. Gary, we're not live. We've pre-recorded this so that the whole over-under team can have some pajama time. What are you going to be doing for New Year's? Are you going to stay up? Are you going to be out raving? Fireworks? Like, what's the vibe? What's the energy?
There won't be fireworks. I might, if my kids want to stay up, then I'll stay up because that's the one time a year that they can, and it would seem rude not to. Bearing in mind that I started really celebrating New Year when I was in Scotland, it's a big thing there. And at the time, you could go to the Tron, which is, on the kind of Royal Mile, and it was still manageable and it was great. And it took me a while to realise when I wasn't in Scotland, just go to bed.
Basically, if you're not in Scotland, if you're not partying with Scottish people, it's not worth it.
I have these memories of kind of traipsing around London looking for a party held by someone I didn't really know with people I didn't really like. Just kind of like trying to make New Year's work and then realised you don't need this.
Yeah, I think because it's a day that you're told to have fun, I think that sets things up badly. I think it's better to have low expectations. And then if someone comes through with a party or something, great. Or you could just watch, I don't know, is Hootenanny still going? Watch some stories, stay warm. Increasingly, I think I did go to a party last year, but increasingly, I think I'm going to be team sofa,
I've worked something out as well for the new year, which is, because I was a big one for New Year's resolutions. Thing is, a year is a really long time. So now I don't do New Year's resolutions. I just do them quarterly, which I know that sounds really corporate, but like I can see really to the end of 3 months. And so if something's not working, I can stop it after 3 months. And if I end up not doing it after the first 3 weeks, I can always start again in the next 3 months. And so what would usually happen is I'd be like, right, I'm going to the gym 3 times a week. I'm going to this. And then it would get to like third week in January and I'd stop going. I'd be like, oh, well, that's it for the year.
Are you a dry January guy?
No,
do you do that?
No,
because it's my birthday.
My birthday
I get annoyed.
Is in January and and I wouldn't anyway, but no. Are you?
Both of our birthdays in January. Yeah. If anyone wants to send us a present, You've got a few weeks.
Do you do dry January? You do?
No, I don't do dry January. I did it once and I went to a party sober and was like, oh yeah, this isn't fun. The problem with dry January is drunk people. They're really annoying, Gary, if you're not drunk. Just like going to a house party as people got drunker and drunker and they were having a better time. And I was like, this is pretty dry. It was too stark, Gary. But also because it's my birthday and I just think it's a bad time to deprive yourself, My best ever New Year's resolution was to eat pizza every week. Made me happy. Had a great time. Smashed it.
I mean, you got to commit to these things. I used to have, and it became a bit of a fixture in my cohort's calendar. My best friend, Ben, his birthday is the day before mine. He's 1 day older than me, which he says accounts for his relative maturity. I'm not so sure. He used to be a DJ. We used to have a party sometime around the beginning of January. And it was before dry January really took off. And it was great because we would pay for the venue and it was far enough away from people's New Year's resolutions that they forgot that they weren't supposed to drink. Everybody was broke. And so here was this party. All you had to pay for was the beer.
Okay. So yeah, whether you're getting ready to stay up or hungover, listening to a podcast and plotting your New Year's resolution, hello, Gary and I will be on our sofas. And yeah, we will be back with our regular programming next week. But this week, we've got some highlights from the year. We hope you enjoy them and we hope that you've managed to have a break and enjoy some time off.
I want to talk about turnout and legitimacy. Now, I know from having been a journalist for 26 years, journalists go somewhere and generally speaking, look out for it when you're looking at the coverage. They'll go with a proposition. Let's say they go to Dover and they want to talk about the boats. They'll meet someone who supports the boats, stopping the boats. They'll meet someone who's against it, and they'll meet someone who's trying to make up their mind. maybe 2 of each. They never meet anyone who's not going to vote. They very rarely meet people who don't care because they've paid the price of the ticket. People will bloody care whether they want to or not. And that turnout in this country has, between the Second World War and 1997, it never went below 70%. Since 1997, it's never gone above 70%. So I would call it a crisis. It's a serious crisis in legitimacy. And I think that the turnout is going to fall even further this year because of insufficient interest and because of insufficient aspiration in our political class. But also what's happened, the votes cast for the 2 main parties in this terrible first past the post system has also collapsed. So in 1951, 97% of votes went to either Labour or Conservative. In 2019, it was more like 75%. So if you take the fall in the number of people who are actually voting, and then you take the fall in the proportion of those votes that go to the main parties, then you end up with Johnson's Tories in 2019 being elected with just 29% of the eligible vote. Winston Churchill lost in 1950 with 38% of the eligible vote. So you get a decreased, which I think is partly what happened with Brexit. So we talk about Boris Johnson's Tories having a mandate, and I do kind of go back to the Gil Scott-Heron thing. You know, first thing I want to say is mandate my ass. Like, it's 29% of the eligible voters is actually what he got. Now, that's the game. That's the game. So you can't kind of then say, oh, I want a new game. I want a different game. That is what we're up against. But it should inform the way that we talk about it. But I don't think we are going to talk much about turnout and about legitimacy and about the Green vote. We probably will talk a lot about reform.
Oh, we're going to hear so much about reform, Gary. I didn't know turnout had fallen that low. I think one thing we could do is talk about turnout. A cynic would also say that there's one party who are interested in a lower turnout, who brought in voter ID rules when there isn't much electoral fraud, and who called a general election to coincide with a huge football tournament, talking about turnout and low turnout and the fact that the Tories are absolutely fine with low turnout is something that we need to hear more about. And also, you're right that I hadn't. So it's a cute formula of a journalist on tour. So it's interesting, Gary, you've been a journalist for decades. Obviously, you're now a professor, but you're not a lobby journalist. And for those who aren't media obsessives, there's a group of journalists who are the Westminster lobby. They all sit together in Parliament and they are the official political correspondents, and you probably know lots of their names, and many of them do podcasts. But Gary, you write about politics. You were a journalist, and I believe you were once on Tony Blair's battle bus.
I was. The 2001 election, and I'd love to have been a fly on the wall at The Guardian to think, yeah, we'll send Gary on that. Yeah, that would be good. There were 3 main things that were really weird about it. The first was that you were herded around from place to place. So actually, you saw less than anybody else. You would be in a bus. They always wanted to make sure that you were well fed. But that was not just food. It was also kind of just propaganda nonsense. So that you would be, we're going to Wimbledon to talk to women. Women are important to Labour, and Tony Blair loves women. You'd be spoon-fed this stuff, which was kind of incredibly boring. And they had you, so you would be kind of ushered in afterwards, after Blair had gone in or just before. You were their captives. And that was weird, to be a journalist and be in that situation.
So now I have an image of you being held captive by Alistair Campbell feeding you sandwiches and whispering sweet nothings into your ear.
Yes. Come on, Gary. It's time to disembark. The second thing was that then the lobby journalists, they would kind of gather. Tony Blair would say something completely anodyne, and then they would kind of huddle, and they'd be like, that was a change in his position because in May he said, and it would be like the narrowest. It was like, what are you even talking about? What kind of, he didn't say anything, and yet it's different from the thing that he didn't say 3 months ago. And then the last thing, but by no means the least thing, was that you couldn't poo on the bus. There's been a lot of poo in this episode, but it's true.
I think you're going to need to slow walk me through this. So you're on a physical bus, like a coach that's traveling the country. That's what a battle bus is. And someone said to you that you weren't allowed to poo. Just give me a bit more info.
Oh, it's not like somebody said to me, it was announced to the bus. And I did think, well, how are you going to enforce that? Do you know what I mean? But I think it was an honor system.
So wait, is this when you get on? So there's a group, you are, you're in amongst a big group of journalists, the great and the good, all the big newspapers, broadcasters. You're on a coach like school children. And again, I'm going to make it Alistair Campbell. Sorry, Alistair, if it wasn't you. Before you take off to go to the first campaign stop, someone stands up. Alistair Campbell stands up and says, "Welcome to Labour's battle bus. There's a toilet at the front. No poos."
Yeah, that's pretty much it. But they say I remember them saying literally no number twos. And
they said number two.
Which I then get me a line that this is the most anal campaign ever.
Did you drop a deuce? Did you do a protest poo? And then blame it on someone from the Telegraph?
That would have been a protest too far, even for me. My under the radar is South Africa. Their elections are coming up. It's an issue in a place that's very close to my heart because South Africa is where I got my big break in 94, covering the first elections, the Mandela elections. I was young then. And it was electric. It was amazing. You would be in these sort of rickety stadia and people that hadn't seen Mandela on telly because they didn't have tellies. They'd just seen him on a poster. I followed him around for much of his campaign. You'd see his entourage, kind of the cavalcade coming. And these townships were built in the middle of nowhere. So you could see for miles and you could just see the cavalcade kicking up dust. And then people would start screaming and ululating and singing and kids with no shoes and women with no teeth. And Mandela would get out and he'd wave his feet. It was amazing. Now they're coming up for elections. And there are a few things I think to remember. One thing in particular to remember about South Africa at the time in 94, the fear was, the kind of narrative theme was, this country is about to fall apart. There is going to be slaughter. And you have to remember that just up the road, not long after those elections, was the Rwandan genocide. And people saying, Inkatha, Zulus, Gatabutalezi, all these different ethnicities, they're not going to be able to keep it together. And that didn't happen. They did keep it together. They produced one of the most progressive constitutions, I think the first state to formally recognize gay relationships in its constitution. What they didn't do is deliver for a large amount of their base. And coming up to these elections, it might be the first time that the ANC go below 50%. And also there's been a slump in turnout, which given how hard they had to fight for the vote is disappointing. There is a kind of increase in xenophobia, particularly against Zimbabwean migrants. So the country's got lots of problems. And in a range of ways, domestically, the ANC is underdelivered. Although we do have to understand that in the context of what was expected. But it's still underdelivered. And it's run the country on its own for 30 years. That's not good for anyone.
It's the only party that's been the party of government.
I also think it's important to understand that, or in my mind, to celebrate that the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, the ruling that they brought down on Israel, that it was plausible they were committing genocide, that came from the ANC and from its tradition. And it made me proud and pleased to see this black-led African country teaching the world what justice means.
Yeah, it was a beautiful moment. You're right, it has been underreported. I haven't seen a lot of conversations about the anniversary. I think it's bittersweet, right? Because it's a time when the left won, when the socially just thing happened, and also the economic inequality in South Africa is pretty huge and pretty desperate. And the ANC haven't delivered for everyone that voted for them and supported them. But yeah, I think the thing I'm interested in is this idea of it's also the challenge of the Revolutionary Party becoming the party of government. And I think it's true across at least African liberation movements. And I think it's worth, I guess, having a bit of compassion for the ANC, because you're talking about a group of people who for decades had to operate with a hierarchy, had to operate on trust, and had to operate in secrecy. You know, there was an armed wing of the ANC in Quinto Sizwe, and there was infiltration, and they were up against a very powerful and invasive state. So it's that thing where the thing it took to be a good revolutionary leader, to be a successful liberation army, is then not necessarily what you need to be a good, effective democratic party, although are there any of those anywhere? Do you think there's political hope in South Africa? What do you think is going to happen in this election? Zuma's still there, isn't he? Still holding on?
Yeah, I was at the big service in Soweto after Mandela died. Zuma spoke, and there was booing in the crowd. And it was interesting how the booing happened, because it started at some distance from where I was. It gained pace as other people thought, oh, people are booing. You know, Zuma was a mess, I think. There is the EFF, which is a kind of Marxist-inspired, the Economic Freedom Fighters, I think they're called. But then there is also a threat from the right, from the Democratic Alliance, the DA. First of all, there is the issue of low turnout, which is also, we talked about that last week, and that's also an issue here. And if people don't find a buy-in, then of course it does matter who wins, but they do have decreased legitimacy. But then it's not clear to me if the ANC's loss will end up being the gain of the right or the left. And the polling in South Africa, because lots of people don't have phones, will be insufficient. My guess is, as is often the case, the people who are most likely to stay at home are the people who I would most likely want to vote. And so the low turnout will serve the right and not the left, would be my guess.
As we're recording this, there isn't an election result, but potentially as you're listening to this, we might have a result. But yeah, I think there's a through line to a few things we've spoken about. There's a lot of young people in South Africa, on the continent of Africa generally, as we see in many countries around the world. Political leaders are older. They don't represent most people. And I think this is as true of South Africa as the United States, as the UK. I think politicians have a sell-by date. Like, I think they go off like milk.
You are really down on older people today. Can I just say that?
I think I'm ageist. No, I'm not down on older people, but I think people should plan to transition out and be cultivating younger generations of people in politics.
There is something about entitlement. Bear in mind that we have been talking about the veteran Labour MP who's been in power for 37 years in Hackney. So there is that.
And he still does a great job as the MP for Hackney.
By that standard, then, people can do well, but it's hard. There is a sense of entitlement that comes with being in power.
My over the top for this week is the French election result. And sort of Macron is a wanker. Or Macron?
Start hard.
Macron
is
a wanker.
Right, okay. Yeah. I think if you're following with wanker, then the pronunciation really does sort of stops mattering after a while.
Yeah, you're right. That bloke that runs France is a real dickhead. Okay, so stay with me. Obviously, alongside England's dramatic triumph in the football, we saw, and I'm sure many of our listeners watched the split screen of the far right and the left reacting to the exit poll.
Yeah, that was awesome.
It was a clear win for the left, which we have to feel good about, on high turnout, on like decades high turnout. And when the votes were still sort of piling in and the news channels were like, it's a record turnout, there was the part of my brain that was like, oh Lord, the French fascists have turned out on record numbers. So it was wonderful. It felt great. I think all the activists who organised and all the people who turned out should rightly feel happy and proud. Macron was not a strategic genius with this. He is very self-centred. He cares about himself and his own power. And he rolled the dice on letting fascists run parliament. He didn't see the left-wing coalition coming. So for those not following closely, all of France's left-wing parties, from the Greens to the Socialists to Mélenchon's party, united to form a left bloc, and that bloc has the highest number of seats in parliament. Not enough to have a majority on their own, but most French people voted for an unambiguously left candidate. Macron didn't see that coming. What he thought he was going to do was be like, me or Le Pen, what do you want? And that wearing some of the clothes of the French right, passing horrible immigration bills, having sketchy politics, and then sort of hoping that you can play this game of like, well, you don't like me or my party, but I'm better than the actual fascist. And I think people are still being like, he's a strategic genius.
Oh,
and he's not a
saying
strategic
that?
genius.
No,
he's a chancer.
Yeah.
I don't know why I'm going to use relationship analogies with all these politicians. I'm not dating any politicians. But it's like you make up after the argument and then you're like, you feel all of the relief. And it's like, but who fucking started the argument? Like all the adrenaline coursing through everyone's body. And then it's like, oh, the relief. But did this need to happen? Was this necessary? I have a few friends and former colleagues who live in France. They all happen to not be white.
No one happens not to be white, Karis. It's a gift from God.
It's true. It's a gift from God. Most of them are French Algerian. I don't know if they would all identify as French Algerian, but like they are people who are on the front lines of French politics. If people are Islamophobic, they are the ones who get harassed on the streets when racist immigration bills get passed. And they are the ones who had to come out onto the streets and organize for candidates, not Macron. It remains to be seen what this victory for the left will mean in parliamentary terms. And I have a sneaking feeling that Mélenchon, who's the kind of, it's obviously reductive to do this, but I'm going to do it because my friend who is French did it too, who's sort of a French Corbyn, is going to get peeled off from that coalition. Most mainstream coverage is already like the controversial Mélenchon. One of my friends that I spoke to about this, he was like, he's pretty much the only politician that challenges Islamophobia and racism and talks about the French state as like producing and manufacturing it to divide working class white and working class people of color. And that was not always Mélenchon's politics. He's been on a journey, as they say. So if he and his party get peeled away and the socialist or the Greens lumped together with Macron, then is it a victory or are the left just propping up this centrist dickhead? There's also the people that Macron surrounds himself with, his spin doctors and advisors, but also there's this group apparently who were quite instrumental in the surprise election of people who have these like semi-official roles. So there's a guy called Bruno Roger Petit, Thierry Solène. There's, I think he doesn't have a job anymore, but the kind of former News Corp lobbyist, Frédéric Michel. And a lot of these people have ties to the far right or to highly problematic French business interests in African countries. There was a recent, like in the last couple of days, revelation that one of these men was having dinner parties with Le Pen and people from National Rally. There's a lot of digging into and kind of poking at Mélenchon on the left and calling them controversial. But I actually think Macron is quite controversial.
My takeaway from the French elections was, why couldn't we do that? Why couldn't we imagine if there had been, I mean, one of the reasons is we don't have PR and we don't have 2 rounds of voting. And that would have made a big difference. I would love for the strand of politics that represented the Greens, the Independents, to say, okay, election, we're different. We've got different politics, different red lines. But in this area, you stand. And we'll support you. And that had there been one left candidate, and I'm talking left in just left of Labour, there's a whole load of space there, those results would have felt different. We are hampered by the first past the post, but we are also hampered, I think, by a kind of sectarian politics. So I'm hoping that in the politics in between the elections, there is more of a sort of pooling of the energy.
I think I'll give you my under the radar, and it is the election results in, I'm going to say it wrong, Thuringia, a region in East Germany, where the Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD, the far-right party, the Nazi party, won 33% of the vote this week. It got some coverage. Obviously, it's not an election result here, but I think that under the radar for me is with results like this, and the riots over the summer, I guess it's the rise of the far right and of white nationalism. And Under the radar stories are stories we think have been underreported or reported in the wrong way. And I feel very passionately that what's happening right now isn't being dealt with well by the mainstream media. We get these moments like riots or protests or election results. And there's again this kind of shock horror and a deep dive into the most visible parts. So like with the AFD result, Bjorn Hock is the leader of the AFD in that region and is a truly charming individual. This is someone who's been fined multiple times for using Nazi slogans, something that is not legal in Germany, and kind of does this like, oh, well, I didn't know it was a Nazi slogan. But he's also, since his initial fine, has like done a call and response. This is someone who a journalist once sat down and interviewed and was like, guess the quote, is it your book or Mein Kampf? And he himself could not tell. And I believe it is legal in Germany and generally to call him a Nazi because of his politics. So he won an election in a part of Germany where unemployment is slightly higher than in wealthier regions. There is a sense that people feel left behind, that to get jobs, they have to migrate to the West. And so it's a story that's familiar, but that I don't think we're digging into sufficiently. We're just being shocked when these people pop up, but we're not really having a conversation about what has led to the rise of the far right, how we're going to deal with it. And also, like, what is the alternative story that needs to be told that isn't immigrants are to blame for all of your problems? So yeah, AFD/white nationalism is my under this week.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a good one because if and when it's Muslims that we're talking about doing things like this, there is a whole raft of they don't understand European civilization, they don't subscribe to European values, it's a murder cult, it's a death cult, they have to be put under surveillance. But the biggest threat to Western democracy at the moment is coming from white supremacy. That's the biggest threat. And it's understood as almost like a whoopsie, you know, that's a bit worrying. Where did that come from? And like you say, they don't deal with the roots of it. And one other thing I think is really kind of interesting is there is a significant support for the AFD in West Germany, but it's bigger in East Germany. And there you have to ask yourself, there was a communist state in East Germany for the best part of 40 years. What did they do? What did they do? What did they say? What did they not say about race and racism that left those people so proud? And the reason why it relates to Britain is a lot of these areas where people were out rioting were kind of Labour voting areas as well. You know, in 1950, Walter Ulbricht, who was the leader of East Germany, said, we have gotten rid of racism. There is no more racism. And that was the end of it. And then 1989 came, and lo and behold, they started calling 1990 to 94 the baseball bat years in Germany because of the attacks on asylum seekers and migrants. There is a broader question of the far right, but then there's also the question of failures of the left, I think. Neither of them are particularly examined well.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the stat that got reported constantly with this recent election result was, for the first time in 80 years, a far-right party has won in Germany. And I think we could talk about Germany, we could talk about Italy, we could talk about the Netherlands, we could talk about France. I guess the thing I want to talk about is that this is a trend that's happening across multiple countries at a similar moment for a reason. And obviously in Germany, it feels particularly egregious because it's a country that at least tried to deal with and talk about its fascist history. My understanding is, you know, the same thing didn't take place in Italy, for example, around Mussolini. But yeah, I think one of the challenges is that A, we have to talk about stuff that's been happening over decades rather than in the last few years. And journalists often don't want to do that. And then I think B, there's this manufacturing of some of this stuff by the state and elites. Like Samuel Huntington, who's an American international relations academic expert, published an article which became a book called The Clash of Civilizations in the wake of the fall of the Berlin Wall. So I think maybe the article's the 80s or early 90s, where he, an elite thinker, very explicitly says, we've defeated communism. The next fight is going to be with Islam. This Islamophobia, which fuels a lot of these far-right movements, is something that was constituted and manufactured, not just by people on Telegram or TikTok. Yes, these groups are mobilizing online. Yes, Telegram is scary, but really the full conversation talks about the ways in which elites and the center in a lot of these countries, if not reinforcing anti-migrant sentiment, certainly not challenging it. And in some instances, manufacturing it. So yeah, it feels like there are a lot of chickens coming home to roost. And as well as having the real conversation about why this exists, we also pretty urgently need to talk about how to fight it and how to stop it. And that was a beautiful thing about the Walthamstow mobilization in response to the riots in the UK, that people turned out in numbers to say, no, you don't represent us. These aren't your streets. My understanding, others will have followed it a bit more closely, was that the police were hesitant or reluctant to encourage people to come out on the streets. But in the end, even the Met Police's statements, not the government's, but the Met Police named the community response as part of what dealt with the riots. And that is what we, and I'm going to speak for over under listeners, but maybe not, maybe some of you are far right, feels unlikely. We need to be organizing, because the police can't fix this, the government can't fix this. These are our communities and we need community responses. And I hope people learned that lesson from Walthamstow. I didn't get to go, but people I know said it felt good to be there. It felt important. It felt powerful. Obviously also lots of milling around, but that's just protests. We are the ones that stopped this unrest by reminding them that they don't have the numbers.
Yeah, in the words of June Jordan, the African-American essayist, we are the ones that we've been waiting for. I feel like there are things the government could do. And one of the things the government could do is not encourage the rhetoric. That the government has done this thing of kind of sending the bigots to jail, the ones that they caught, but potentially embracing the bigotry and putting it into legislation. It worries me beyond this immediate conversation that kind of, we have this Labour government that while those things were carrying on and while the embers were burning down, we had the winter fuel payment is not going to be made, that all of the things that assist community cohesion are either not being done or they're being delayed. The notion that some elements of society have that nobody's speaking up for us, we're going to take it on ourselves and we choose these people as the victims, becomes much more attractive.
And I think that's a parallel with Germany, where they have this like traffic light coalition who are in this, similar like sort of centrist impasse because there's so many parties and they can't get stuff done. And it feels like we've got this centrist Labour government that really isn't putting out a socialist agenda or talking about community cohesion. I think the thing that also not shocked me, but freaked me out a bit after the Southport killings, which were nominally the thing that sparked this, but the speed with which the protests were happening, like this was like a pre-baked thing that was ready to go. And it was a perfect storm of like the main drivers and catalysts of modern fascism, because it's like little rumor, it was a Muslim that did it, boom. Everyone just happens to know where all the hotels are that refugees are being held. So yeah, that sense of there's this organized thing, and that if the only state response is you're thugs, we're putting you in prison, we're not dealing with the sickness. It's absorbing some of the concerns, but then nominally being hard on the violent face, the explicitly violent face of the unrest. I'm thinking about Jack Straw saying he's not comfortable with a woman in burqa or niqab coming into his surgery. I'm thinking about Boris Johnson calling Muslim women letterboxes, or the weird comments by Jonathan Ashworth and Keir Starmer about people from Bangladesh coming to the UK in the election campaign. If we're not honest about the fact that there's like a sort of sanitized version of this that political elites produce, then we can't really deal with the unsanitized version and the quote unquote thugs. What are you doing to cheer yourself up?
Well, I bought a beanie. I know.
Didn't see that coming.
No, and it's like I'm wearing a midlife crisis on my head. People.
No, do you know what this is? And people
are
who
talking.
are listening, People are talking about the beanie. Do you know what? I actually clocked your beanie. Gary and I occasionally bump into each other in real life. Very magical, exciting times. And I saw the beanie and do you know what I actually thought? I thought you've gone full hipster now. It's quite a hipster beanie.
Yeah, see. One of the mums from school said that. She said, oat milk in a beanie. What happened to you?
Oh my God.
I know.
You're drinking oat milk. Oh, he's gone full hipster. I love this for you. I love you getting into your hipster era, you know?
Okay.
This is a vibe.
I didn't see the conversation going this way, but yeah, I thought...
Cheered me up, no end.
I thought that would be a nice hat for... When it gets real cold, you need something that covers your ears, but that would be a nice... I didn't expect that it would provoke the kind of conversations that it had, which are more or less like, what the fuck is going on here? Who are you?
Put it on again. I want to see it. I want to see it properly.
Okay, I'm going to take off the headphones.
Vibe. Yeah, let's see it. It's chic. I've screenshotted it. I love it. I just think, do you know what? We needed something to cheer us up. Gary's gone hipster. There you go, guys.
Gary's got a beanie. That's not the same thing.
Hipster, like many things, is a spectrum. And you're now on it, Gary. You are now on it. I love this for you. I'm a bit of a hipster. Those who know me know. So I'm into it. What else can we get you doing that's hipster?
I'm not talking.
Grow a beard?
I'm not talking about this no more. What are you up to?
Yeah, I'm good. Still hauling myself out of various pie charts and exit polls from the American election. My social media addiction kicks into overgear at times like this. Also, I'm going to make a pedantic point, but it is an important one. All of the charts people are sharing, we do not yet have robust data about who voted in the recent presidential election. We have American exit polls. And for those of you listening in the UK, Americans do not have an equivalent of John Curtis. These exit polls are not like robust works of all the sophologists in the country locking themselves in a room, which is what happens in the UK, producing a relatively accurate prediction of the result. These are polls conducted by media organizations on election day, which is why you get a lot of other questions about what people think about American economy.
Yeah, they are notoriously, it's not that they're notoriously inaccurate, they're just notoriously wayward. They will get some things right, they will get other things wrong, but they are kind of not in themselves unreliable. And the narratives that emerge immediately in the wake of an election are shaped by them.
It is also for British people or people who are used to UK elections. We have this one big exit poll that is done by all the leading academics and has been done for like decades. And there's a methodology and, you know, it's given to all media outlets, and John Curtis and all of his fellow nerds are locked in a room. Like, it's definitely worth, if you're seeing charts with like, this number of black men voted for Trump, like just try and find the source data, because it could have been a 1,000 person poll conducted online, you know, and not to say none of this means anything, but I feel very deluged by very hot takes from a lot of people who predicted the election completely wrong about 48 hours ago, but are now entirely confident that they know what's going on. I won't name. There's a particularly notable one example who's another political podcaster.
You're talking about Rory Stewart. You're talking about, I know.
Yeah, I mean, he was, yeah, you know, I know. I was going to subtweet him, but no, I mean, he just was 2 days ago. He was like, polls are wrong. Kamala Harris is going to win, which was a spicy take then, Gary. But I mean, maybe you're more used to it because this has been your beat as a journalist for a long time. The quickness with which people who had a really strong take that was provably false are then able to give you a new take that you should definitely believe, I've just found really fascinating this year.
I feel like it's a function of this period, which is that the commentariat is at whack with the electorate, and they cannot distinguish between what they want to happen and what they think will happen, and they can't distinguish between description and prediction. I found it most telling during the Corbyn years in 2017 when the election came in, and I'm aware that Labour did not win, but they increased their vote share and they increased the number of seats. It was almost like a qualification for being on an election poll was that you had to be taken seriously. To be taken seriously, you had not to in any way think that Corbyn could do anything. The clock struck 10, the exit poll came out, said Labour's going to do better than everybody expects. It's going to be a hung parliament. Now the anchor would say, I'm going to turn to you, who got everything wrong, to tell us what's going to happen next. And in every studio, it was the same. And they were like, I didn't see that coming. It's like, No. And you know what? Your job is not to predict the future, but you didn't even describe the present. That's the problem. You were dismissive of everything and everybody. And here you are in the studio telling us what comes next.
It feels like, and it felt like this during the campaign, there's a lot of pearl clutching and there's a lot of journalists letting their revulsion of Donald Trump just bleed into the coverage. I don't know if it skews it, but as you say, it means that we don't always get accurate or the best news and analysis. And I thought a lot about the rally in Madison Square Garden, which when it happened, I was a bit like, Trump people gonna racist, kind of their thing. But we had days of like, this is it. Think how many Puerto Ricans there are in Pennsylvania. That's a game change. A part of my brain was like, but he called Mexicans rapists and murderers. Like, that didn't stop him getting elected. Are we really like, what's different about this rally this night? And it felt reminiscent of 2016 with the Access Hollywood recording where he was the grabbing by the pussy. Like, however many years on, this is his third presidential campaign, hopefully his last. This sense of like finding him distasteful or shocking and being almost surprised by what he can get away with and what his followers can get away with. It just feels a bit silly.
Yeah, there are two things going on there. And one is in terms of background, the elite nature of journalists and commentators and their desire to dismiss the great unwashed and to almost just say, well, people just shouldn't even have a vote because you're going to get it wrong. And that kind of chimed with the way that the British press reported Brexit, or the liberals in the British press reported Brexit, and how they've done Trump before. I do think there is another thing, though, which is that if we take presidential elections as being a kind of narrative of let's just say a narrative in the past 30 years, the game has changed. And that in the past, a slight gaffe here or there could be turned into a major thing. And with Bill Clinton, the issue was quote unquote character. I remember covering the 2008 election and thinking that Obama had a chance at the point where there was a poll that showed that most white women would prefer to carpool with him than John McCain. And thinking, okay, well, that is kind of interesting because there was this notion of like...
Snap, by the way, would not want to carpool with John McCain.
There was this notion of who would you most like to have a drink with? And with Trump, that has changed. So all of these things which would have been disqualifying just are no longer, that game has changed. And the number of Trump voters that I spoke to 2016 through to 2020 who would say, I don't like him, but he'll get the job done. You know, one woman said, I'd prefer an arsehole doctor who cured my cancer than a really nice doctor who didn't. The game has changed, but I'm with you, and I'm with you absolutely on the pearl clutching and the kind of righteous indignation, because it's like, look, your job ain't to like him. Your job is to describe him. And maybe we would have a better understanding of this game if you were watching the game rather than trying to be a referee.
My under the radar is the Irish election. People might remember the last election in 2020 was where Sinn Féin had a huge breakout success, won the second highest number of TDs. They weren't even standing in every constituency, but like had this big shock victory. And everyone was like, oh my gosh, Sinn Féin, could there be an Ireland? Very, very dramatic. This time, Sinn Féin is standing more candidates. The current government is Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, and the Green Party. So the two sort of centrist right-wing parties that tend to alternate power, teamed together, refused to do a deal with Sinn Féin. They've said they won't do a deal with Sinn Féin this time either, with the Green MPs to form an election. So I think interesting things about the Irish election. One is that Sinn Féin, who were on this real high in 2020, Mary Lou McDonald, who's the kind of charismatic leader, was seen as the Taoiseach in waiting. And, you know, Sinn Féin had this more left-wing agenda when they stood in 2020. People I spoke to say, you know, they're still centre-left, but on things like migration, they wouldn't say that they've got very left-wing politics. So I think interesting thing is Sinn Féin, who came out of the last election on a real high, have seen a massive decline in their poll numbers. The current Taoiseach had a bit of a Gordon Brown, Gillian Duffy moment where he had a sort of confrontation with a care worker who said afterwards that she was sort of in floods of tears. And then the other thing, which is very different to our politics and to a lot of the politics we're seeing in like Western democracies, is there isn't a single party for the far right, anti-migrant, fascisty vote. There isn't like a Nigel Farage or Donald Trump. So what you see instead is lots of left-wing parties or parties of the left, Sinn Féin, depending on what you think. There's a Green Party, there's a Labour Party, there's a Social Democratic Party, there's a People Over Profit Party. And then on the right, there's this sort of national alliance. But what you tend to get is these independent candidates that represent the far right. And then, you've got like the National Party, Ireland First, Irish People. The reason I think that's interesting and relevant is that I think that so far that's meant the far right have been less powerful, but B, I think it has seen then far right sentiment creeping into other parties. So I don't know if people remember, but we're now on the anniversary of the Dublin riots, which were not dissimilar to the unrest we saw in August of this year. 3 young children were killed. And there was a huge swell in anti-immigrant sentiment and a lot of misinformation online about why the children had been killed and that basically immigrants and asylum seekers were to blame, and there were riots in Dublin. So, yeah, it's a big election. It's an important election. I think the riots and the way that immigration got pushed onto the agenda is like part of a broader trend that we're seeing in lots of places. And then one thing I think is different in Ireland that is really great is that housing is a huge, huge issue. That's not great. Huge issues with homelessness and like sky high rents. But all of the parties are competing on how many homes they're going to build. And all of them believe that social housing is part of the solution. That's my kind of potted summary of what's going on in Ireland. I'm sure those listening who live in Ireland, are Irish, might have other thoughts. Please write in and tell us. But yeah, I think it's a weird one to not be talking about, given the relationship we have with Ireland. And it's probably not likely because of coalition politics. But there is a world in which you could have the Irish Taoiseach, equivalent of Prime Minister, could be from Sinn Féin, and then we'd have a First Minister in Northern Ireland who was also from Sinn Féin, which would be historic. Don't think it's likely to happen, but it could happen.
Yeah. I mean, it's generally interesting, I think, the way that Britain doesn't relate to Ireland. Do you know what I mean? Given how long the war went on, given that there's still 6 counties that Britain took and won't return, and that, you know, if there's a referendum, I assume that those 6 counties would vote to stay. I don't know. And they call it Ulster, but it's not Ulster because Ulster is 9 counties and Britain only kept the 6 counties that would have a pro-British majority in and so on. So the degree of I'm always intrigued by the degree of ignorance that there is towards Ireland, given the amount of violence, military control and resources that the country poured in over the years to actually control the place. It's kind of like, would you not want to know what you're stealing? Would you not want to know more about it? Because I go quite a lot, I've seen, first of all, and I mentioned this in an earlier podcast, the kind of rise of the right in Ireland, which is a kind of weird thing for Ireland of all places to rise up around immigration, given how many more people there are who are Irish, who live outside of Ireland or who are eligible for Irish citizenship, who live outside of Ireland rather than inside of Ireland. That is still a migrant country. I don't think there is anyone on the island of Ireland who doesn't have quite immediate connections to someone who is an immigrant. And as I said on an earlier podcast, Ireland has less people in it now than it did before the famine. I don't think there is any other Western country that could say that there are still less people in it than there were in the kind of mid-19th century. And so when they run on campaigns saying Ireland is full, it's like, well, it's not, is it? Don't be silly. And I know I hear from family members that Sinn Féin, they got their eye on the prize, that they could be a party of government. The only reason that they're probably not a party of government is because they didn't stand enough candidates at the last election because they surprised themselves. And they've started talking out of both sides of their mouth.
This is exactly what my Irish friend said about them, talking out both sides of their mouth in immigration.
And kind of legitimizing, legitimate concerns of the working class kind of talk, as opposed to, listen, this is not who we are. There is an argument, and if you can't make it in Ireland, you can't make it, about the benefits of migration, the need for order. We could talk about kind of order and it being orderly and, safe. My experience of being in Ireland as a black person, it used to be that you were kind of somewhat anomalous, a bit of a curiosity. Johnny, what you know? This man's come all the way from Africa for a pint of Guinness and you'll not be serving him. I remember somebody actually saying that about me while I was in the pub waiting for a drink. I'd come from Africa for a pint of Guinness. Will you serve this man? Whereas 15, 20 years after that experience, someone shouted the M-bomb at me out of a kind of passing van. I'm not saying that, you walk around Ireland and, you're going to get attacked straight away, but things have changed. And as for the election, I hope that whatever cynicism there is about the main parties, that they don't vote for the worst parties. Irish politics are very interesting because an awful lot of it, when I ask local people there about, well, what's the difference between Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil? It all goes back to kind of 1921 or 1916. Together, they're like, there was that party in Mexico called the Party of Institutional Revolution. And that's how I think of them both, as being born out of this context that happened 100 years ago. And I think one is more for the farmers. The one is understood to be more for the rich, but, quite a lot of the farmers are rich. And they take up a lot of space between them. And then there are these Sinn Féin, which has always been there, but was never really particularly kind of strong in the South. And then, Labour and Green and so on. I don't know who to root for, but I'm rooting against the status quo in a good way. There is rooting against the status quo. You end up with Trump.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the really interesting difference in Ireland, right? There isn't this one lightning rod party for disaffection, although we will see what happens with the quote unquote independents who tend to be far right. One of the people I spoke to prepare for this works for an organisation called Uplift, which is a sort of progressive campaign group in Ireland. And they did a really interesting paper about vacant and empty homes in Ireland, to your point about Ireland being full and just how much of the housing stock is derelict, holiday homes that no one's using. And I think the interesting thing is there are these similarities in our politics with Ireland, but also really stark differences. But one of the things that the person from Uplift said, she was like, the real work for activists begins once the programme for government is agreed, because unlike in the UK where, we had our vote, Keir Starmer won, huge majority, there's nothing for us to do, but he's sort of got a winner takes all mandate. Once the votes are counted and we know how many TDs everyone's got, it's then who can do what deal and what are they promising. I think it will be interesting to see who prevails and what prevails.
Thank you for listening to Over the Top, Under the Radar this year. As always, you can support the podcast in at least 3 ways. Join our Patreon community at overunderpod.com.
Share our social media posts or follow us at over_under_pod_.
And finally, recommend a friend to be part of our growing community. And of course, subscribe wherever you listen to the podcast and get notified every time we launch a new episode.
You've been listening to Over the Top, Under the Radar with me, Cara Sofoko, and Gary Young.